So, okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to come and speak to your audience tonight about embracing a national movement for racial equity and social justice in gifted education, advocacy at the school, district, and state levels. This particular topic is very important to us as our work deals with equity and racial justice and has been for years. And so tonight we want to begin this conversation by providing an overview, setting the stage for the national agenda for anti-racism work in gifted education. And then we want to talk about state advocacy for anti-racism work in gifted and talented education via the Georgia Association for Gifted Children's Coalition for Access and Equity. And then we will talk about district administrators and their partnering and how anti-racism work in gifted and talented education unfolds or can unfold. And then looking at what it means to move beyond bystanding and readiness for upstander action at the local level. And if we have time, we'll have some Q&A. So first we'll get started with some context, understanding where our field, from whence our field has emerged. Gifted education lauds one of the infamous scholars from Stanford University, Lewis Terman. And we start here because oftentimes when we talk about the history of gifted education, it begins with the father of the Stanford Binet, who is also considered the father of gifted education. But what is not often discussed is the role of systemic racism in psychology and how it influenced the ideology of how gifted and talented students were perceived, who could be gifted, et cetera. And so as a president of the American Psychological Association and a renowned scholar, Dr. Terman was very instrumental and strategic in promoting elitist and racist ideology. And even Stanford today acknowledges this legacy and this history. And fortunately, we can have conversations around it because it's important to understand how the eugenics movement, which was a part of a legacy that really created policies and practices that undermined the value, worth, and belief in the dignity and intelligence of Black and others. It really emerged from individuals such as Dr. Terman. And so when thinking about his research, one of the infamous studies, and just to give you an idea of what it sounds like and from whence it emerged, he commented in one of his infamous studies focused on intelligence. He noted that it was interesting that these cases, MP and CP, represent a level of intelligence which is very, very common among Spanish, Indian, and Mexican families in the Southwest, and also among Negroes. Their dullness seems to be racial, or at least inherent in the family stocks from which they come. So in future research, there will be discovered enormously significant racial differences in general intelligence, differences which cannot be wiped out by any scheme of mental culture. Children of this group should be segregated in special classes and be given instruction which is concrete and practical. They cannot master abstractions, but they can often be made efficient workers, able to look out for themselves. There is no possibility at present of convincing society that they should not be allowed to reproduce. Although from a eugenic point of view, they constitute a grave problem because of their unusually prolific breeding. And so his findings perpetuated this idea that there needed to be segregated classes, and research informed policy. Research also informed practice. And so this is the heritage from which gifted education has emerged, which influenced the use of IQ tests in many situations and in many cases. There were scholars who were confronting the work of eugenicists and racists and the scientific racism that existed during that time, such as Dr. Martin Jenkins, who set out to prove that Blacks were not intellectually inferior. As a graduate student, and his work with Dr. Paul Whitty at Northwestern University, he sought out Black students in Chicago who were known to be bright within the community. And his work discovered a young girl, and this young girl represented the case of B. And being published at that time was a very important feat. Now, part of the reason why we share this context is because we want you to understand that the field of gifted education, rooted in psychology and the heritage of scientific racism, has existed. It took individuals such as Dr. Jenkins to call attention to this reality through the works of the case of B. And we share this work with you, among others who will be presented later, because oftentimes this work has been overlooked. Dr. Jenkins' work was overlooked for 70 years. But now the field of gifted education has not only understood the significance of the work, but embraced the work. And also we're here to share it with you today. He was an upstander for racial equity during that time in the early 20s and 30s and on through the decades. An upstander is one who engages in conscientious, deliberate, and immediate responses to help confront systemic racism. And so a part of why we're here today is because we're encouraging and wanting you to stand up to the systemic racism that has existed and in the past and how it manifests today. In Georgia, there's a heritage of our field confronting the ideology of IQ-based definitions and paradigms. And Dr. E. Paul Torrance to the left was one of those scholars who was around during the time of segregation. This is a part of the heritage of the field as well, to overcome segregation and the ideologies of IQ-based definitions, where mental ability tests were the primary uses for identifying students for gifted programs. So Dr. Torrance, along with Dr. Mary Frazier and many others, but I'm going to highlight these two right now, in Georgia were very instrumental in proposing multiple criteria and helping educators to move beyond racist-based ideologies that were informed by IQ-based instruments to introduce the idea of creativity and motivation as attributes associated with giftedness, to redefine who could be and what giftedness means and who could be considered gifted. And so they were confronting the status quo. And this encourages us today because we borrow from that legacy of upstanders who were confronting the status quo and encouraging the field to grow, who were not being bystanders. And by bystanders, we think about that. And I frame this in this idea of bystanding in my work have just been recently trying to introduce this idea that sometimes these are not bad people, but they're people who are bystanding and doing nothing. And a part of the reason why individuals may be bystanding is for self-preservation. They're thinking about their own benefits, the natural instincts or learned dispositions to remove oneself from harm or situate oneself to seek or sustain benefits. So if you're a teacher or educator or a principal, talking about systemic racism can put you at risk. And so a part of why an individual may be bystanding is because of self-preservation or the perceived inability, lacking the skill, knowledge, or competence or resources to address a racial crisis. Situation ambiguity. It can be unclear what the circumstances surrounding the evolution or the urgency of the crisis. Like, why are we addressing underrepresentation now? And what do we do about it? What are the issues around it? It may not be clear. And so some people back away or do nothing because of situation ambiguity. Or diffusion of responsibility, disassociating oneself with roles and duties in this crisis of underrepresentation. Some individuals may think that it's someone else's issue or problem or responsibility to address this issue, to talk about race issues. Oh, it's the Black folk, or it's this Hispanics folks. It's for them to address, or someone else to address, or another group to address. And then this idea of pluralistic ignorance. where individuals may be using or misinterpreting the surrounding group's response to justify avoidance-related feelings, beliefs, or actions. And this is about this idea, well, nobody else is doing anything. Everybody else around me seems to be okay. So we wanted to call attention to this idea of bystanding because it's important that we move beyond bystanding to upstanding. And sometimes a court case can do that. A court case can call attention to a crisis, and it encourages individuals to become upstanders. We've experienced this in the field of gifted education in Elgin and U46, this court case, McFadden versus the Board of Education, where this called national attention to racial discrimination in gifted education. Headlines, focused on this case. Parents press for attention to programs for gifted students where there was discrimination found. Desegregating gifted education, lessons learned from the discrimination case, where Dr. Donna Ford served as an expert witness. The field of gifted education, we weren't quite ready for this at the time in which this case was revealed. However, once it was revealed, we did go into action. When I say we collectively, I'm talking about the field of gifted education began to respond slowly, but respond, to begin to think about the ways in which racial discrimination is a part of the field. There was a national conversation after this court case began, a national conversation at the NAGC convention, which featured past presidents. And this was one of the first conversations at the national convention where race was addressed squarely. And it was because of the court case, where we were no longer just bystanding and letting this happen. We had to address something. We had to model for the field and for scholars and teachers how to address this issue. And NAGC, along with leaders across the country, got to work to help address what was going on in Illinois. And Illinois, the district, proved that gifted programs can be racially diverse. Now, how do we know? We know because the representation of students in the gifted program in the school, which at one point we'll see the change, where at one point it was underrepresented, with 42% of this, approximately 42% of the school district was Hispanic, but in the gifted program, there were 2%. There was a change after the court case, and individuals became proactive, and Hispanic students were equitably represented, and white students and others were more equitably represented. So it can be done. The question is it necessary to have a lawsuit in order for this action to bring about equitable change? And we believe that it doesn't have to be. If we're upstanders and we're proactive, then it doesn't have to be. There's work that's been put forward to close the excellence gap by Jonathan Plucker and Scott Peters and others, because the lingering effects of systemic racism still surface. In the field, we still confront racism. We've had to write articles to come to terms with the reality that systemic racism is a part of the field. And then George Floyd. When that happened, not only did the nation respond, but the field responded and took advantage of this opportunity to call out the need for equity and racial equity to be addressed. And then NAGC, the National Association for Gifted Children, denounced systemic racism and owned it. And this was an important step because I'm a part of a consortium for the inclusion of underrepresented racial groups in gifted education. And this is the work that we've been doing for years. And George Floyd, unfortunately, was a part of the trauma that many of us experience and many children experience when the knee is on their neck, when they're perceived like term and viewed many Black students and Hispanic students and others. And so get your knee off our neck was our position. And the field responded in kind. The leadership of the National Association for Gifted Children acknowledged that systemic racism for the first time publicly in such a bold way, publicly, acknowledge this. And this is why we're bringing this to you today, because we want you to be a part of this national movement and this agenda to address racial equity and social justice. Championing equity, we want you to be familiar with this statement and the action, and begin to identify where you fit within this action and to partner with NAGC to get this work done. Not only is NAGC involved, but the field where Terman emerged, APA, the American Psychological Association, has finally made a commitment to addressing systemic racism and offered an apology to people of color for its role in promoting, perpetuating, and failing to challenge racism. Failing to challenge means bystanding, okay? And so we're here because we're being proactive and there's work that's being done. And so there's proactive state advocacy for anti-racism work in gifted and talented education via the Coalition for Access and Equity.
All right, so I am going to take this next leg of our presentation to talk just a little bit about that jumping off point for our state organization. Teresa and I together co-facilitate a coalition for access and equity within our state organization, GAGC. And at the same time that these things were emerging back in the summer of 2020, I believe it was at one of our state board meetings where we began to talk about this. And we presented a sense of urgency for our organization to respond, in addition to the national organization, about just the state of what we are dealing with as far as race and inequity and how that is playing a part in our own field. And so at that time, our board decided to create a statement of anti-racism, much like many other organizations did. But I think what made our work distinctively different is that we agreed that we wanted to make this actionable, that we wanted to not just create a statement, but that we wanted to begin work. We are very fortunate in Georgia to have a long legacy of doing the work, of trying to promote equity. We were one of the first states to create a multiple criteria, but we all had realized very quickly that that was something that had happened 20 years ago. And while we had been a leader at that time, it was time for us to be a leader again. And so we created a statement of anti-racism, and then we came together with teachers and educators and university faculty across the state to create our coalition. And so what Teresa and I are going to kind of share with you here in this next section is kind of the timeline, what we have been doing over the last year and a half with our coalition as a way to see what can be done as a state and as a state organization. So Teresa, you feel free to jump in at any time. So this is a shared leadership. But again, as I mentioned, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, as you mentioned, NAGC issued their statement denouncing systemic racism and pledging to aggressively address issues of racism and social justice. And so we met as immediately following that, I believe it was in July, so almost immediately, our executive board, the Georgia Gifted Association, decided that we would take up NAGC's call to action, and we wanted to develop our own statement on anti-racism and also to establish our Coalition for Access and Equity so that we would begin to push through and challenge some of those issues. We established a coalition. We began by problem solving, problem sensing, and what followed were 5 challenging and productive sessions of brainstorming, identifying issues about what we needed to tackle, setting historical and current perspectives on the work ahead, establishing working groups, and developing an action plan for implementation. But the action plan was not a culmination, it was just the beginning. It's the way forward. And so since then, we've established working groups, and we've had some successes with yet more to do.
So we decided early on that we wanted to speak a language that our gifted education specialists would be able to understand and really ring true to them. And so we decided to use a creative problem-solving process to actually do this work. And so part of the process was that in some of those meetings throughout the year last year, we came together with different stakeholders to really talk about what the problems were. So to identify those issues, problems, challenges, and inequities that we were seeing at all different, with all different perspectives. So some administrators, some gifted coordinators, teachers, classroom teachers, gifted education specialists, people who were doing testing and identification. So all kinds of people coming together to try to identify just what those problems were. And just like when we teach our students about problem solving, staying in that place of problem sensing is really uncomfortable. It's not a place, we want to jump right to the solutions and the answers, but that's not always how we solve the problems best, right? So really being able to explore and identify what's going on. What is the state of Georgia right now? What are we experiencing as far as inequities? So we stayed in that fact finding or problem sensing for a while. And part of that work is that we brought in a couple of experts to speak and talk about some of the issues that we were dealing with. And Teresa's going to talk about that in just a minute. And then we used a framework for Dr. Mary Frazier's 4 A's in order to help prompt us and to use as a tool to continue to find those problems. Two of the guests that we had come and speak to our coalition, Dr. Sally Crissell, who just finished up as the president of the National Association for Gifted Children, I guess right before Dr. Plucker. And Sally was a state gifted coordinator here in Georgia for many years, and she was at the helm during the transition into multiple criteria. In addition, Sally has been actually had Laurie's job. She was the director of innovative and advanced programs in Hall County, which has produced, I don't even want to guess, over 20 specialized programs in schools for advanced learning in that county. So a wealth of experience and leadership within our state. And she came to talk to us about really pushing us forward and this idea of we can't rest on our laurels of the things that we did 20 years ago. There's still work to be done. A lot of the same issues that we were trying to address many years ago are still with us and kind of give us that charge of what is it that we're going to do. And so that was a wonderful address to our coalition, as well as Dr. Christina Collins, who is a professor at Texas State University, whose research and work looks at racial inequity, developing identity of students from underrepresented groups. And she was really able to come in with a fresh and newness to these issues and problems that we were identifying and help us to, and to give us a framework for really looking at all that. And so both of those meetings were very helpful and informative as we were using that creative problem-solving process.
The only thing that I would add to that is that I really liked how they framed it for us. They gave the historical background, but then they also gave us a vision for going forward, because I know that some of the issues that Dr. Crissell brought up, we ran into almost immediately when we were establishing our coalition. And Dr. Christina Collins, when she talked about not addressing, but redressing, remember she said redressing and she explained a distinction, redressing and neutralizing institutional racism. And she offered advice and guidance on replacing a broken system that under-identifies minority students for gifted programming. And so they both offered us tremendous insight into our equity work.
after we had those visitors and we had that really exhaustive list of problems and issues that we were trying to address, we utilized Dr. Mary Frazier's 4 A's as a way to help us really make sure that we had kind of covered all our bases. And so if you're not yet familiar with Dr. Frazier's 4 A's, this is what she created to kind of a set of lenses to, I think they're a great set of lenses really to look at all of life if you want to know the truth. But this is a great way was a great way for us to really look at things. So talking about, she talked about these 4 A's as barriers to identifying gifted students. But we were looking at these to help us, continue to identify those problems. So what are the attitudes, the positions or emotions towards culturally diverse or economically disadvantaged students? So that idea of deficit thinking, the things that prohibit us from really being able to, dispel myths and get rid of barriers and help students from minority or low income backgrounds. Access, so what are the ways that these students are being considered? What kinds of access do they have to programming and opportunities for talent development? Of course, assessment, so the ways in which we assess them and dealing with issues of instrumentation, bias, and all of that. And then accommodation, how are we designing programs and using curricular experiences to meet the needs of a lot of different kinds of students? So we used these 4 A's to help us really examine the problems and create this final list of robust things that we wanted to tackle within the coalition. And so what happened after that is that we presented these lists of problems at our state conference, and we garnered input from attendees who attended our session that gave us great feedback that then helped us to analyze and organize all of these problems into some themes. And those themes included professional learning, policy, and then resources. And so those became our 3 working groups that are still in existence right now. And so those working groups helped to create about 14 projects that are currently underway. Some are finished, some are in progress, some are just getting started. But these 4 working projects that are being worked on by 3 working groups have been going on over the last year. We have recently decided that we needed to establish a steering committee, and we're going to begin that this January. And so that is just a little bit about where our coalition is, what we've accomplished so far, and hopefully that gives some insight into some of the ways that you can step forward and to practice anti-racism in gifted education. So I think I'm turning it over to Laurie now.
Hey, hi, everybody. Yes, so I'm excited to talk about this too. And I will say that, the 3 people here are all mentors for me that I've learned so much from. But when we wrote that statement for GAGC together, one of the things we put in it was that there would be a coalition for real change. And that I think was key, because then we had some actionable things to do. And the way Teresa and Meg approached it was not, let's go fix this. It was, this is a systemic problem, and we are going to have a long, sustainable time of approaching and attacking this problem. So I just can't say enough about that coalition. So I wanted to say, personally, for me, even the word anti-racism or being an anti-racist was not something I had really heard of before George Floyd and this journey for GAGC. And so when I listened to his book on tape, I was struck by some of the things he said, but in particular, if I thought of GAGC, for years, we have worked on a theme of more access and equity. So that's something that has been a part of GAGC. It's also part of my school district and what we want to do. But listening to the idea of anti-racism was a real paradigm shift for me. It was like something I had not thought of before. Because one of the things Kendry said was that we don't need to look for racism, or that think that change means that we have to find someone who's racist. It's not like that. What he was saying was we need to find where it's lacking and what's going on with it. So I love this quote. This quote, I wrote it down and I've just kept it because it helped clarify for me. His quote is, "A racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups." So that racist policy might be something that was never put in there with the intention of racism, or maybe it was many years ago and no one's thought about it since, who knows? But that's not the point. And he talks about the point is not that. The point is, what are the outcomes that are happening and what policies are in place that continue that inequity? That is a racist policy. And then the anti-racist policy, he said, it's any measure that produces or sustains racial equity between racial groups. So we want to have anti-racist policies. Those aren't statements about anti-racism. Those are policies that we know are promoting equity. And that, for me, it was just an aha moment of saying, wait a minute, there's something we can do. Because up to that point, I think I had been thinking we're going to look at this problem and we're going to do better. We want to make things better. And by golly, we've been wanting to make things better for many, many years. And I guess sometimes things have gotten a little better. But that wake-up call of, no, there's something you can do. You can look at what are those policies and processes that are having outcomes that end up in racial inequity. And then what can you do to make those different? So that was just a huge aha for GAGC, for me personally, and then also for me in our district. So if you'll go to the next slide, this was when we started to look, and I think you might have to click it twice and it'll come up, it'll be fine. But I did start thinking of, okay, we would look at data in my district on gifted, on who's taking advanced classes. And we had even for the past 3 or 4 years been sharing that data with administrators and saying, hey, here's the data and here's the data by demographics. Try to make that better. We're showing you the problem. Let's try to make it better. Instead, this paradigm shift was, no, let's start looking at what our policies and processes that are racist because they are continuing to sustain what we know is racial inequity. So I'm not going to go into all these bullets here, but root cause analysis is something we do in education when we're doing school improvement plans or district improvement plans. Oh boy, is it exhausting, right? And sometimes you feel like you're just jumping through hoops. But in fact, root cause analysis can get at the heart of what is happening, what policies are there, what processes are there. They're the real cause of these outcomes that are showing us there's inequity. So that's one of the things we began to do with our data. We began to say, let's ask why, and then let's ask why again, and then let's ask why again. And let's keep asking why till we find some root causes. And then when we see that root cause is a process we have in place, a policy, something we're doing, let's make that change into an anti-racist policy or process. So that was so eye-opening for our school district, I think. And so the next slide talks about what we did a little bit with our identification of gifted students. Because as we began to dig down, why aren't our gifted numbers showing racial equity? Well, turns out it starts with nominations. What if we looked at who's nominated? Well, what if we looked at what are the processes in place we are using for nomination? And which of those are sustaining racial inequity? And where might a change make a difference there? That was such a different way of thinking. Instead of looking for people or types of policies that are set out to promote racial inequity, we weren't looking for that. We were looking for root causes that are keeping that going. So one of the things we figured out, of course, was our nomination collection process, because our nominations were not even showing any racial equity. So, well, I mean, some, but, you know, not across the board. So we implemented this last year, and somewhat the year before, we began to look at access growth scores and just say, well, if a student who's a native speaker of another language shows sustained access testing growth over 2 years, isn't that an indicator of something? Let's have a nomination team look at that student for gifted testing. We just unearthed the strength. And so that was huge in our district. We looked at MAP growth. We implemented MAP with a few pilot high school or pilot elementary schools. And even our really good schools, the schools who were great at identifying students, suddenly said, oh, wow, here's some students that were not on our radar, and they've shown up. So trying to find ways to nominate students that you're not already using, and then noticing the ways you are using them and saying, why are we still getting the same results? How can we change that? So, and we used the tabs, which that's a whole nother workshop. That's how wonderful we all think the tabs are. Another one of Mary Frazier's tools. But we began to do that and began to see a difference in our nominations, and then a difference in our students who are gifted. And we're really at the point now, after 2 years of this, we're just getting that data in. I can't wait to analyze it. The other thing, which is kind of on the flip end of it, if you'll click one more time, we'll have that piece on the left. But the other thing we did as a district was we have a rigor goal, and it's a very broad goal. And it just says that we think that our graduates, our 12th graders, that 70% of them at least should take one honors or advanced or AP or IB or dual enrollment course, just one. We believe they have the strengths to do that. So what we found over the past 5 or 6 years is we're meeting that goal. We were at 70%. But then we decided to break it down by demographics and say, well, what's happening when we look at it more closely? And what we found was that, I mean, you might notice right away, even our gender problems at some of our schools. And this data is 2 years old from a couple schools, but you'll see that we have a school where across the board, we've got our females accessing those honors and advanced classes way more than our male students. And why? And again, we had to say why? And I remember Sally was part of those discussions. And at one point, we were noticing that a lot of this happened in middle school when students were recommended for honors or advanced. And Sally said, is there anything more pitiful than a middle school boy? And maybe that's why we're missing some of our boys, you know, because if that's where we're making these decisions, we're not giving them a chance of when they work through that challenging time of puberty. That was one of the kind of funny asides. But then we began to look at these numbers, and my particular school district has had a growing Hispanic population for many years, for 15 years. And you can see where our Hispanic students over time have not been as overlooked. It's not where we need to be, but we're looking at it going, well, we're seeing some strengths in our Hispanic students. But then if you look at our Black students, this was eye-opening for us to really look at and say, wait, how can this be that we have such a discrepancy? And these are percentage of that population. So those are very real numbers for us. And we did that root cause analysis where we really began to look at how do we recommend students. We began to see that in 5th grade, when students are recommended for a 6th grade advanced class, that although we want to have flexible opportunities for students to, kind of jump into the appropriate advanced opportunity, we didn't have as many as we thought. And how do we go about addressing that and go back to strengths? One of my favorite stories from this is we had one administrator who took this seriously, and she went back and looked at the Black students in her high school who did not have an honors class, and she was looking at 8th graders going into 9th grade. And then she looked at those students and she looked for strengths and found some students that really had demonstrated some strengths in an area, and she went ahead and put them in that advanced class. And she talked about the first day of school, a young lady came up to her and said, I need a schedule change. I wasn't supposed to be in an advanced honors class here, but I'm in one. And she got to look at that student and say, oh, I picked you for that. I saw your strengths. And that student made an A in that course. That was a huge paradigm shift in academic identity, but also in a bigger sense in the school, being able to say, let's find where we're missing our students. Let's go find those students and give them those opportunities. That is anti-racist policy and procedure that can make a huge difference in attacking that racial inequity. So it's something that I know I'm very proud of that we're doing as a district. We're not done by any means, but I felt like after understanding what anti-racism really meant in terms of policies and processes, it just helped to know where we can begin to do some real work that makes a difference instead of just saying, let's try to improve this. Let's see if we did improve. It's like, oh, no, we're going to find what's causing it. And we're going to make sure we have policies that find strengths and opportunities for all of our kids. So those were kind of some of the big takeaways at the district level as we looked at anti-racism.
Okay, so that brings it down to me at the local school level. And so while I've had a lot of positions throughout our district, I think that as a teacher, I'd be thinking, what can I do at my level? And I really, for me, it kicked off when I was selected to be a Javits Frazier Scholar for NAGC. And that's why I first heard about Dr. Mary Frazier and her amazing work. And as Dr. Hines mentioned, using her 4 A's as a framework for everything. And I used it as a framework for developing my gifted programming in my school. And for me, that began by optimizing the role of the gifted specialist and the classroom teacher. When I came to my school, I was the first full-time gifted specialist that they had. Before, the gifted specialist kind of traveled between schools, but my coordinator at that time decided that we should have a full-time gifted specialist in each school. So I immediately began to see the role of a gifted specialist as more of an academic coach. This is the person that's going to help the classroom teacher or work in conjunction with the classroom teacher to bring it forward. And if you are the gifted specialist or the gifted advocating teacher in your school, think about the little things that you can do that will build an environment that's conducive to support, to identifying gifted children. I knew that I needed to build a community within my school that supported identification for gifted students and design a curriculum that supports inclusion. And that meant being the teacher, seeing how the lesson is presented, and then maybe contacting somebody at the district level to talk about maybe coming in over the summer and rewriting those lessons or tweaking them and adding things here and there. So with the 4 A's in mind, the first one was attitude. And you have to go back to your school or think about your school now and what is the attitude toward gifted and talent development programs and enrichment? Who's responsible for that attitude? Not who should be responsible, but who is responsible? Is it something that's important to your administrator? Is it important to the other teachers in their school, in the school? Is it important to the parents? And if it is, then you need to set about ways to bring in the parents, make it a welcoming environment, make it feel like it's okay to come in and ask questions. And for me, that even meant standing up and asking for maybe 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning or end of a PTA meeting, just to do my little plug and offer that I'm willing to meet with parents to discuss test scores, because parents get test scores and that means nothing to them a lot of times, especially when you start with the language about standard age score versus percentile rank, and that's very intimidating. So be that person that they can come up to and ask, can you sit down and discuss this with me? Can we talk about ways that I can enrich my child? And with teachers, that could be asking them, and I did this with my teachers. I said, draw me a picture of a gifted child. And like 80 to 90% of them drew a little boy with freckles and a pocket protector and, you know, kind of Sheldon-esque. And I said, this child is not in your class, so who are you looking for? If you're not looking for it, you're not going to see it. And so it could be that little thing where you come in and show them not only what gifted looks like, positive and negative, because we do that. This positive traits of gifted, negative traits of gifted, but what can it look like? How does it manifest itself in children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds? And build a community, get your parents involved, look at your stakeholders, get your coordinator involved, get the other teachers on the bandwagon. Talk about how you can include diverse people and their contributions in your lesson planning, and not coming up with a Black History Month project, but having those people, women, minorities, figure in and out of curriculum throughout. And then how are children, the second one was access. How are you accessing the children? How are they being identified for programming? Is it based on test scores? Because we know that test scores they can be kind of hit and miss. And you need to think specifically about talent development and enrichment are not gifted identification. So you can have a little flexibility here. It's not going to be the test is and that's it. You can add in a little flexibility and think about what can you do that's going to draw out those abilities of those students. You have to make a concerted effort and have teachers keep wow folders. I call them wow folders. Just make a little note on a Post-it and say, Bobby Sue said this today, or Johnny did that during our lesson, because that's not something that they're not going to remember. But if it's significant enough to stand out a little bit, jot it on a Post-it, stick it in that wow folder, and guess what? When it's time to complete that evaluation on that student, you have that information that you need to give you a bigger, clearer picture. We want to make sure that we're seeing the whole child. And the way to do that is to talk to parents, to see them out of that classroom setting sometimes, and also to make note of those little wow moments. The next one was access, attitude, assessment, which I just kind of sort of hit on. We know that there's test bias, and focusing solely on achievement tests is not going to find the children that you want. So testing has its place. However, when you're building your program, you want to look a little bit beyond. And then finally, accommodation. We're all familiar with the phrase windows and mirrors. And mirrors refers to the curriculum that reflects our culture and helps build up identity in our children. Windows refers to the curriculum that offers a view into someone else's experiences. So the persistent barrier is the units of study that don't incorporate culturally relevant material. And so you need to work with your district's gifted program, or even work with the teachers in your school and establish a curriculum writing committee, and just suggest it if it's not already in place, and take a look at it. Include the contributions and history of other cultures. And I like to point out that it does go on year round, not just in February. And I mean, adding the contributions of diverse figures in all aspects of the curriculum, and building a culturally sensitive curriculum is crucial to student success. I guess that is it in a nutshell. Talent development, whatever form it takes in your school, collaboration, push in, pull out, advanced content, you have to provide opportunities for talents to surface. And once they do, we must engage them and nurture them and move them forward to the next higher level.
Thank you all so much. I have so many notes written down, and we've had some right here. We've had some questions come in from those folks joining us on Facebook. So I want to make sure that we have time to get to their questions. One had to do with the assessment piece and universal screening or universal testing. And I know you're in Georgia, we're in Colorado, and viewers are coming in from all over. But the idea that if you can get universal screening or testing, we can find more of these students. What are your thoughts about trying to get universal testing or screening into schools? Whoever wants to talk about that or has an idea or thought.
I'm sure Laurie and Teresa have more experiences doing universal screening, but I would just caution us to think about that as one way of doing things. It's just one choice that we have in front of us. We definitely should be doing it, but it's not the end all be all, but it is something we should be doing.
Yes, I agree. And I think too, we want to improve that, and we try different things and see what they yield, which is also helpful. But whatever we do, the other, there's the wonderful thing of, okay, we've done the universal screening, we've done the testing, and the child is stamped and blessed, gifted. That's a great thing. But to view it also as a way of finding strengths in students. So we say we do a universal screening, and we say, okay, the student was in the 80th percentile in this area. That's not going to qualify them for gifted services or in that particular area. But boy, that just told us something. And what are we doing for that student? So using everything that we do like that as a way of attending to the advanced learning needs of many students, I think is a part of the conversation as well.
I think to address the racial and economic gaps that we find with any instrument, we have to be mindful of the norms that we're using. And the field has just embraced, I think, pretty widely closing excellence gaps. We have to look at local norms to the point where we're comparing students in their context. I mean, there's a federal definition that talks about comparing students' age, experience, and background and cultural experience. So we can't just stop with administering a universal instrument for universal principles and nominations, et cetera. We have to look at local norms that could be district, school, and community. Okay, so we just want to emphasize that that's a next step to reduce the impact of systemic racism when instruments yield outcomes that are disparate for various racial groups.
I think a couple of themes that you all have talked about is we don't want to use one tool or one thought of what gifted is to identify that nomination is so important, that we're not working in silos of gifted education and then everyone else doesn't know anything about what gifted education is. We have to be working in collaboration and sharing that information. I was going to ask you, Meg, I had your Coalition for Real Change. You had 3 working groups, professional learning. What were the other 2?
We kind of thematically grouped them in the best way possible to have those working groups, and they kind of fell under policy, under professional learning, and then we had one that we coined resources. So the ways in which we can get all kinds of information or produce resources or have things so that teachers and districts and schools can have access to these things in order to implement or learn about or know about in their districts.
We had some questions about those actionable items because it's nice that this conversation is happening. It's nice that organizations are recognizing and apologizing, but then, okay, like you said, we want to do better, but what are those actions that we take to actually create the better? And I think that those 3 working groups that you created are somewhere for people to start with. Professional learning. We have to teach others. Looking at our policy, like you said, with the root cause analysis, what policies do we have in place that are keeping students from being identified gifted and accessing, and then resources for people to do the better. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I also loved how you said sometimes we have to sit in the problem solving or problem sensing longer than we want to, because we all just want to jump to, okay, what do we do? But we have to sit there and really be thoughtful about, okay, what are we looking at? And so that we can not just throw band-aids on things, like sometimes we quickly just want to solve, but we can truly do the work that needs to happen. And so a lot of our questions were about action, because we want to do something, but figuring out what that root cause is and sensing what the actual issue or concern is an important step that we don't want to miss. So I appreciated that part also.
Sure.
And I also think, just in wrapping up in conclusion, I think the bystanding to upstanding, that's an easy 2-word phrase to remember. We have to turn from bystanders to upstanders, and it's a tragedy when it ends up in a court case. We should be doing the work far before it ends up somewhere like that. So any last thoughts from anyone before we kind of wrap up for the night? We appreciate you all so much sharing what you've been doing in Georgia, and your expertise around these thoughts and ideas of how we can better do this at a larger scale, all the way down to the local school, because sometimes you feel like you're fighting alone, or or you're not sure who to collaborate with, or how to move forward. In case people, because we're running out of time, in case people have questions, our executive director wanted me to ask, is there an email, or should they email us and then we would pass it on if they had a question or wanted to follow up with more information about something from the presentation? Tarek, is there a better way to do that?
Absolutely. They can email you directly, and please pass it along.
Okay.
And we can certainly share our email addresses as well.
Okay. So our email is co, like Colorado, cogifted@gmail.com, and we'll pass that along. Otherwise, your contact information is probably on the University of Georgia's website somewhere.
Yes.
But we'll pass it along if you get those questions to us, if you wanted to follow up with something from their presentation. So thank you all so much for joining us. And just to let our viewers know, next week, this is perfect to build off of what we talked about tonight. We have Dina Briez talking about building inclusive gifted programs. So it's a great next conversation to build off of what we talked about tonight. So thank you all for joining us. Happy Tuesday. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for having us. Have a good evening.
Thank you.